Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, Tony here. Welcome back. And if you've been listening, you know that I've been sharing my story with you the past several episodes, and I'm going to continue to do so today. I was in the middle of my story called The Marriage Disaster, the story of my marriage to my wife, Sherry, and how our marriage became an instant disaster and how sex was at the epicenter of our marriage. You could tell last episode I was sharing a little bit about Sherry's story. I've been telling you my story, then her story, and you can kind of see that both of us were just a mess. And the primary mess was around the issue of our wounded, broken sexual selves. The deepest pain and hurt and shame and brokenness and sin of our lives for both of us was around the issue of sex. And I think this is true for so many people, that people are deeply broken and wounded in the area of their sexual selves, and it has to do with their story. It has to do with the ingredients that got put in the cake mix, you see, and the cake that comes out of the oven is based upon the ingredients that got put into the cake. And there's people that have been living their life for 20 and 30 and 40 years, people who have been married for 20 years, and they're not able to have sex. They're not able to relate to each other in a healthy way and experience their sexual self in a healthier way. And it's because so often people have this stuff in their stories that they've never understood and they've never dealt with, you see, in an appropriate way to process some of this stuff and to receive God's healing and wholeness and redemption. And that's why we share our story. I'm going to continue sharing my story about my marriage, but before I do that, I want to interrupt to inject another story that occurs to me that I should have told earlier, and I don't know how or why I skipped over it, but there's a significant story that I should share, and it has to do with my early failure in marriage. I'm not in marriage, in ministry, I'm sorry. You see, I had shared with you that when I became a true Christian, a born-again Christian, I immediately fell in love with God, and I knew that I wanted to serve God with the rest of my life. And so after high school, I went to Bible college, and it was during that first semester in Bible college that my first pastor had a sexual affair with my first girlfriend, and that thing was an entire mess and a very hurtful episode in my own story. But I did go through Bible college for 4 years, and I graduated from Florida Bible College with a bachelor's degree. I majored in biblical education and had a minor in theology, and I loved God and I wanted to serve God. But you see, there was this problem in my life, and the problem had to do with sex. And I didn't understand this yet. I didn't know what was wrong with me. But you see, it was kind of like I was a Dr. Jekyll and a Mr. Hyde. There were like two different Tonys. There was the Tony that loved God, the Tony that was a Christian, the Tony that wanted to serve God. I wanted my life to count for the kingdom, and I wanted God to be happy and pleased with my life. But then there was the Tony who was struggling so much with his sexual self. You see, from the time I became a Christian, I just could not resist sexual temptation. Whenever sexual temptation would come around me, I seemed powerless to resist it. So I would act out. I would masturbate compulsively. I was filled with lust essentially all the time. I would look at porn at times. I became sexually involved before I was married with several different young ladies. And I was conducting myself inappropriately in the verbiage of an earlier episode. Well, episode 1, I asked those two questions, and the second question was, why the gap, you know? Why is there such a gap between the sexual man that I know God wants me to be and the sexual man that I am? And it's like that defined me as this young man in Bible school. My senior year in Bible college, I was elected student body president, and I got a full tuition scholarship, and it was quite an honor. There may have been, 1,600 students at the school that year. And the point is, I was lifted up as the role model. Look at Tony Ingrassia, this gifted young man who's articulate and he can speak and he's going to be a champion for Christ. He's a young leader and he's the kind of young man and young pastor and spiritual leader that we're training at this Bible college. And so we're going to elect him. He's the cream of the crop, the student body president. So I'm being lifted up and esteemed as this young role model, an example and leader as a young Christian man. But there was the part of Tony that nobody knew about, the secret part that was struggling so much with his sexual self that couldn't resist sexual temptation. You see, so it's kind of like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Well, I went through those 4 years of Bible college, and I graduated. And after I graduated from Bible college, I came back to the St. Louis area where I was from. And it's a little bit of a long story. I'm not going to go into the details, but one thing leads to the other. And I end up almost on accident starting this young person's Bible study. Actually, what happened was there were 4 young men who were jamming in this basement, a house in our neighborhood, playing the drums and guitars and bass, and they would jam. And so I wanted to learn how to play the guitar so I could maybe play guitar at a Bible study. So I asked these kids if I could sit in, and I began to sit in with them, and they were teaching me how to play guitar. And I started to share with them about Christ. Because after all, that's what I had been trained to do in my 4 years in Bible college. I was a champion. I'm going to go out and win the world to Christ. So I start sharing spiritual things with these young guys, these teenagers, and we're having Bible studies, and I'm sharing with them, and one thing leads to the other. And before you know it, some other kids from the neighborhood start sitting in. They want to hear the band jam, and I'm leading this Bible study, and pretty soon more kids are coming, more kids are coming. We name it Canaan Ministries. And it's growing, and before you know it, we go from 20 kids to 30 to 50 kids and 60 and 80 kids are coming to this thing. And before I know it, it's kind of exploding, and this young ministry is born. And I feel like, holy cow, this must be God's will. God's given me this ministry and to minister to all these young people. Well, I don't know if you can see where this story is going, but the fact is there is no way I was at all prepared or ready or equipped to be a leader, a spiritual leader in a ministry or a young church. And what happens is this young Bible study evolves into a young church, and we decide to start a church, a young person's church, Canaan Bible Church. And so we start this church. I'm a single young man starting this young ministry, and basically I'm set up for disaster because I don't understand my story. I don't understand the ingredients that have got put into the cake mix, and I don't understand what's wrong with my sexual self, and I haven't dealt with any of these root issues, you see. And so here I am surrounded by single gals, and sure enough, before you know it, I'm crossing lines of impropriety, and I become sexually involved with several different young ladies involved in the ministry, and it was terrible. It was absolutely horrible, and I'm very ashamed of myself, and I'm ashamed that was such a problem for me became a problem for other people. And I wasn't able to control myself. I took advantage of others. I hurt others. I perpetrated harm upon others. And in a short matter of time, this becomes public knowledge. And essentially, I lost my ministry. I was demoted. I stepped out of the ministry. It was a public disgrace, a public failure. And this young church, this young ministry was shattered, and people scattered. The church came to an end, and people went different ways, went into different churches and situations. And it was right about this time that I met my wife, Sherry. In fact, a young lady that was coming to Canaan, her name was Jill. And it turns out Jill has a sister named Sherry. And Sherry began to come around some of our church events. So we'd have barbecues and play softball. And Sherry wasn't coming to church, but she was coming to some of our events. And that's how I met her originally. And I say to this day that I fell in love with my wife throwing a softball back and forth at St. Ferdinand Park in Florissant, Missouri. At one of these events, I was getting acquainted with her. She's a beautiful young lady. I was very attracted to her, and we became involved with one another. And now fast forwarding back to story number 8, our marriage disaster. I shared with you that we dated for 6 months. We were engaged for 6 months. And then we got married. And when we got married, even though we didn't understand it, I was in fact a young man with a sexual addiction. I hadn't dealt with any of this brokenness in my heart and life. Sherry was a young woman with a sexual aversion. You heard some of her story last episode, how she was raped at the age of 13, had an abortion at the age of 17, tried to commit suicide at the age of 18 and 19, and then I met her when she's 21 years old. And here these two young people get married. These two very broken, desperately broken young people get married. And by the way, I've come to believe since then, as both a pastor and as a professional counselor, that most people do not understand who they're marrying on the day that they get married. Most of us, you see the outside package, you like what you see, you're attracted to this other person. But, I didn't even understand the story of my own life at this point, let alone understand the story of Sherry's life. I just see a beautiful young lady, but I didn't know that she had this story. I didn't understand that she had been raped and how that affected her and her promiscuity and her abortion and her suicide attempts. And you see, when you get married, you don't just marry a person. The fact is, you marry their story. You marry a person and their story. It's a package deal. And most of us don't understand the implications of a person's story, and we don't necessarily understand who or what we're getting in this other person. And so Sherry and I get married, and I'm not kidding you guys, literally on our wedding night, my wife does not want to have sex with me. Something was wrong, literally from day one, and I didn't know what it was. I thought at first, well, maybe it's just the helter-skelter of the wedding. You plan for months and getting everything ready, and you're nervous, and people are coming in from out of town, and so she's just nervous and flustered from the wedding, and so something just isn't right. Now, mind you, the event did happen on our wedding night. It did happen, but I could tell that something was wrong. It's as if Sherry was there, her body was there, but Sherry wasn't there. Like they say, the lights are on, but nobody's home. I could tell something was wrong. She just wasn't into it, and I thought, well, it's probably the wedding. Things will settle down. She'll be okay in a day or two, and everything will be normal. Well, normal never came. A day or two never came. And all I can tell you is that my wife was shut down against me so strong, it was unbelievable. From the first day of our marriage, it's like if you turn a light switch on or off, the switch was off. And Sherry simply could not respond to me, either physically, emotionally, sexually. She just never, ever wanted to have sex. And I didn't know what to do with that, and it kind of freaked me out. I'm thinking, holy cow, God, I've struggled with sex my whole life, and I've acted out, and I've done things wrong, and I try not to do it, but I still do it, and I feel guilty, and I feel shame, and I pray, and I promise God I'll never do it again, and then I do it again. and I'm finally married, and for the first time in my life, I can actually have sex with a person, with my wife, and God won't even be mad at me. It won't even be wrong to have sex with this person because she's my wife, and she don't want to have sex with me. She never wants to have sex with me. And so we're off and running. And in the early months and the early years of our marriage was a disaster. We would go for prolonged periods of time without any sexual intimacy between us. One time, we literally went 9 months without sex between us. Then we might have an intimate sexual encounter. Then it might be months in between, another 4 months, another 2 months or 6 months or 5 months. And so I could literally probably count on one hand the times we were sexual in the early years of our marriage. It was just absolutely terrible. And I didn't know what to do with this. And I didn't handle it well. I felt rejected. I felt hurt. I felt like my own wife didn't want me. I felt angry. I felt frustrated at Sherry and at God. And as a result of this, I would act out. The fact is, I hadn't dealt with any of my own root issues yet. I didn't understand the ingredients that were put in my cake. I didn't understand the fact that I had a sexual addiction. So even though I'm not having sex with my wife, doesn't mean I wasn't having sex. I was still masturbating. I'd look at pornography. I was filled with lust. I would flirt with other women. On certain occasions, I would go to a strip club. And in the end, I ended up becoming involved in several different multiple affairs, sexual affairs in the context of my marriage, including a 5-year affair with my best friend's wife at the time. Can you imagine? I was the best man in their wedding. And I'm horrified to say this. It's one of the most shameful, heinous, terrible things of my life that I became sexually involved with my best friend's wife. I highly recommend that you not do that. You know, if you're going to have an affair, don't pick your best friend's wife. I understand that this is the way these things happen sometimes. You know, who do people have affairs with? They end up having affairs with people that they're around on an ongoing basis, and that's what happened in my situation. So our marriage went from bad to worse, and I end up having these affairs. I'm acting out. I'm mad at Sherry. I'm mad at God, and when I would get really, really mad, I would tell God, I don't care, God. I don't care what's right or wrong. You know, my wife won't have sex with me. I don't know how to live without sex. And so I guess I'll just have to find sex somewhere else. And somehow I got to the place in my own heart and mind where I could rationalize to myself these different things that I would choose to do. And I would act out in the course of our marriage. And thus begins a situation that I've come to call the endless cycle, a cycle that I would go around and around and around and around over and over and over again through the early years of our marriage, at least I would say the first 10 to 12 years of our marriage. And this cycle is defined by me acting out. I do something stupid. I do something that I know I shouldn't do. I go to a strip club. I have a sexual encounter, with another person, even though I'm married. I'm masturbating. I look at porn. After I would act out, I would inevitably feel guilty because of my Christian conscience. After all, I'm a believer, right? I went to Bible school. I'm an ordained minister. I love God. I want to serve God. I want my life to count for Christ. But here I am acting out in these ways that I know are inconsistent with my faith and with my very own conscience. It's the gap. It's that gap. Why the gap between the man that I know God wants me to be and the man that I am in my life, you see? And So I would feel guilty. I'd feel shame. And that would lead to me making a promise to God. Oh, God, I would pray, please don't let me do this again. I'll try harder, God. Please forgive me. I won't do this again, God. Just give me your grace. Help me, Lord. And on the strength of that conviction, I would go typically hours or days, and then I'd get upset again about the reality of my situation and my marriage, and then I'd get mad at God, and then I'd act out again, and then I'd feel remorse, and then I'd promise God, I won't do it again, God. And I'd try so hard, but then I'd get upset, and then I'd act out, then I'd feel sad, and then I'd promise God, and over and over and over and over. This cycle defined my life. And by the way, I'm just interrupting myself here to say, I'm not sure, but I suspect that there's a lot of people that can relate to this kind of cycle, because the fact is you are a believer, you do love God, you understand something of spiritual things and the kingdom of God, and you want your life to count for Christ and for God's kingdom. And you know that you shouldn't be doing certain things in your life, acting out in certain ways that you act out. You know you shouldn't look at porn as much as you do, and yet you do these things, and therefore you're in a similar cycle where you act out, you feel shame, you promise God, I won't do it again, I'll try harder, and then you get tempted and you act out again, then you feel remorse, and you promise God again. And so this cycle, I found out, remember I said that I thought I was a freak show? Like, what is wrong with you, Tony? Why can't you control this sex thing? I thought I was a freak show. And as I've shared this story with so many men tell me they relate. My story's like a template that explains their story. You see, and I found out that so many people, so many good people, Christian people that love God and want their lives to matter are stuck in this similar cycle. And this is my heart and my passion, you guys, that this Power of Purity podcast and the Power of Purity conference and the Power of Purity ministry be a resource that can help people find true, genuine, authentic healing and redemption for the brokenness in the sexual part of their life, and can help you understand your story and help you connect the dots and help you put an end to this endless cycle that you've been stuck in for so many years. So Sherry and I are in this cycle for the first 10, 12 years of our marriage, and I become involved in this sexual affair with my best friend's wife. That I'm quite embarrassed of and horrified and ashamed of. And by the way, just as a point of reference, when all of this affair came out into the light, the woman stated that we had had a rendezvous maybe 10 times. I didn't think it was that often. But she said 10. If it's 10, I give her the benefit of the doubt. But my point is it gives you a sense of the regularity. It's not like it was a constant ongoing affair for 5 years. If we met 10 times over a course of 5 years, that's an average of once every 6 months. And I think that speaks of the cycle that I was speaking of. We would act out. I would act out with her, and then I would feel so terrible. Tony, you idiot, what are you doing? Oh my God, you can't do this. You can never do this again. What if my friend finds out? What if my wife finds out? What if the church finds out? I've already ruined my reputation one time back with the whole Canaan event. Are you going to do this again, Tony? What's wrong with you? So I would promise God, please, God, don't let me do this again. I'll try harder, God. I won't do this anymore. And I'd try to push it away. But then the reality of my situation and my horrible marriage would mount up on me. And then I'd get mad at God and mad at Sherry, and I wouldn't care. And then something would happen again. And so over this period of 5 years, I'm involved in this on-again, off-again affair that's happening with my best friend's wife. And that brings me to story number 9, which I call the heavy hand of God. And I've learned, I heard a phrase that I really liked. It said, sin always takes you further than you ever thought you'd go. It makes you stay longer than you ever thought you'd stay. And it makes you pay more than you ever thought you'd pay. And all I can say is that the cumulative effect of the way that I had been living my life was taking a toll on my soul. Let me just say it this way. It is not a good day when you wake up and you look in the mirror and the person you see you don't like. You don't like yourself. You're disgusted with yourself. You're horrified with yourself. You realize you're living your life in violation of your very own conscience. This is not who I am. This is not who I'm supposed to be. This isn't who I want to be. Oh my God, how did I end up in this place? Tony, how are you living like this? What's going on? Like, my life is crazy. You see, on the outside, I had a beautiful life. I had a business, my own remodeling business that I had started. It was a successful business. I had a beautiful wife. I had beautiful children. I had nice cars. I had a house. People would look at my life from the outside and think, man, that guy has everything. His life is awesome. He's so blessed. But people couldn't see the inside of my life. You see, they couldn't see that I was completely miserable. They didn't know that my marriage was a total disaster, that I was a duplicitous man, that I was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde trying to love God and serve God and be involved in church on the outside, but I had this secret life that I had been struggling with for years and years and years, and that I was deeply depressed much of the time, and I felt very far away from God, and I felt disconnected from God, and it's as if I was living in these shadows of deep shame and this endless cycle of this emotional revolt that dominated and defined my life. I'll never do it again, God, and then doing it again, and then telling God I'm sorry, round and round and round. And in the darkest of these days, all I can tell you is I began to despair of life itself. I wasn't sure that I even wanted to be alive anymore. And let me just say something here, tell you something about my own stupidity, because there was a time earlier in my life where I didn't get people who took their own life, people who would commit suicide. I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. And I was very judgmental. And I thought, these people are pathetic. They're just pathetic people. How can you come to the place where you would choose to perpetrate harm upon yourself and take your own life? And I've changed. I understand it now, because I'm telling you, my life was so miserable, and there was such a weight upon my life, and I was so disappointed and disgusted in myself and acting in violation of my own conscience that I began to despair of life. I thought to myself, if this is my life, I don't want it anymore. I am a failure at life. My marriage is a disaster. I commit adultery. My own wife won't have sex with me. I have this problem with sex that I can't control. It's like I hated myself. I loathed myself. And I began to despair of life itself. And you know, Jesus said in John 10:10, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And without a doubt, the enemy of my soul was literally trying to close the deal on my life and perpetrate destruction upon me through me. And I literally began to fantasize and have thoughts of harming myself. The enemy was trying to close the deal on my life. And it was during these days of my darkest despair that God unleashed this odd, weird, but wonderful ministry, what I call the heavy hand of God. And that's my story number 9, the heavy hand of God. And it was only later that I found this scripture and read it, Psalm 31, verse 4 through 5. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped as in the summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. You see, the heavy hand of God, I promise you, friend, you do not want the heavy hand of God on your life. It's incredibly difficult. It's profoundly difficult. And God was laying his heavy hand upon my life. And if you're interested in hearing the rest of this story, tune in next episode. I'll look forward to seeing you there. God bless you.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.
The power of purity.